Hello and welcome to another fresh edition of the program The Pen, where we discuss literature, writers and literary criticism. In today's package, we're hosting Professor Ibrahim Bello-Kano from the Department of English and Literary Studies, Bayer University, where we'll be discussing life and works of Ngugi Wa Thiang'o, who died 5 days ago. Following the death, there have been articles, tributes, and eulogies that have been written on the demise of the great professor, that is Professor Ngugi Wa Thiang'o. On this show, we are going to be discussing these important issues, ranging from his works, his life, and also the arguments that he was able to make during his life. Without taking much of the time, I am Abba Musa Idris, together with my colleague,
Nuruddin Kamisaram,
and also our guest, Professor Ibrahim Bello-Kano. Prof, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mr. Abba. And Prof, let us begin with this question. Who is Ngugi Wa Thiang'o as an African writer?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very quickly, Ngugi was born in 1938 in Kenya. But he was born in one of the rural areas where his ethnic group, sometimes it's pronounced Gikuyu, some people pronounce it Kikuyu.
Yes.
But it was one of the largest ethnic groups in Kenya. But note that he was born in 1938. Now what is important about that date is that it's in the 16th, 17th century, colonialism, colonial culture was on the ascendant until around the 1930s, 1938, just before the Second World War, when, of course, many nationalists across Africa, the African continent, were demanding for independence. But you know that also Kenya was almost a settler colonial country. The Europeans there didn't want to leave, didn't want to go. They wanted to turn it into, what you know about the old Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and South Africa, settler colonial country in Africa. He was born in that period, and also there was the Mau Mau. It was an independent or independence movement, which wanted to recreate African independent, African culture, and African authenticity. So he was born just around the cusp where colonialism was declining, colonial culture. There were the debates about what should be the future of Kenya. Should it be a settler colonial society, or just like Ghana, that would eventually be an independent state? And Kenyatta was active, Jomo Kenyatta.
Yeah, Jomo Kenyatta.
There was repression, he himself was imprisoned. So he was born, by the time he went to secondary school, he attended Makerere and so on. Yes. That was in the air. Nationalist discourse were in the air all around East Africa. And so his first text was 1964, With No Child, and then 65, The River Between. Ngugi was, he was James Ngugi initially, and that Africanist tendency, some African, well, I don't want to call it Pan-African at this stage. It was Africanistic, that's the adjective I would like to use, was in the air. So he changed his name from James to his authentic nativist name, Ngugi Wa Thiang'o, so on, which has a meaning in his own language. And so his writing was preoccupied with, on the one hand, the issue of nationalism and the vindication of African culture, African traditions, the authenticity of African normativity, African demand for autonomy. On the other hand, he was Western educated. He went to Western schools. He went to a Western-based university. My career was dominated by many expatriate teachers and so on. So he was born in that cusp. And his works, the early works, were dealing with how should Africans live. If you look at A Grain of Wheat or The River Between, you can see how religion, Christianity, now having intruded into African culture is dividing people based on religion. And I remember that some parts of Kenya were Muslim, Mombasa area. So Kenya was a multi-religious, multi-cultural country. And also, he was also writing back to famous African authors such as Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. In Heart of Darkness, the river was a source of death and difficulty and lack of knowledge, and all the negative things was associated with the river. In fact, in one of the passages in Heart of Darkness, it is said that the river was a place where the vegetation rioted, and the trees were kings, and the mosquitoes were stabbing instead of biting. So in the river between, you can see how the river now, despite the religious divide, brings people together in terms of their life mode, in terms of their life ways. So despite their conflict, the river now brought them together.
So, Prof, so before you proceed, what does the river, symbolizes in the in the story?
In Heart of Darkness,
yes.
The river was a source of death, an African, in fact, heart of darkness, a heart of lack of knowledge, primitivism, and if you like, the suspicion that Africans were not really human, they were subhuman, because in Heart of Darkness, blacks, the natives, let's not call them the natives, they don't speak, they have grunts, they don't speak, and they walk on their fours, and they want to go to drink at the river, they lap it like dogs do, like cats do. But in the river between, the river is a source of nourishment and life. It brings the people together, despite the division of Christianity and traditional culture. And eventually the conflict is settled by the process of the river, from which both communities draw their nourishment. So in river between, the river is a source of unity and nourishment, authenticity, and allowing life to flourish. And Heart of Darkness is the opposite.
So this is like a direct retaliation.
We call it right and back.
Okay,
in English literature, we say Salman Rushdie invented the expression right and back to the center. And many even things fall apart. You see, it's a right and back. If you look at if you read the novel, around the 1890s, racist writers like Winwood Reade and others said that Africans had no culture. Hegel wrote a famous book, the history of the philosophy of consciousness, history of the philosophy of consciousness, in which he says that Africans were enveloped in the dark mantle of night without civilization. They have never built any culture. No, they have not left behind stone monuments or the Western understanding of civilization living in the city and great cities and so on. So some of the, if you look at the end of Things Fall Apart, the colonial officer begins to write a story about the pacification of the primitive tribes of the Lower Niger. So, and if you look at the works of Ayikwe Ama, fragments,
beautiful ones and not yet born.
So that's one. But there's another theme I should quickly point out. Ngugi also became unhappy with the way our independence turned out.
Of course.
There is a subgenre of writing called post-independent or post-independence disillusionment. Many writers felt that what happened after independence wasn't laudable, wasn't salutary. There was corruption in Kenya, especially the nationalists who took power. Well, you can see what's happened all around many African countries.
So, sir, his novel, that is Weep Not Child, which was considered by many of the people now as his first novel written. And also the one, I think that one was written in 1940.
No, 1964.
1964. And Grain of Wheat was written until
a year after,
that's 1965. So there is another book, although it is not a novel, but it is a drama written, that is Black Hermit, which is also written by.
Right.
So did he write that book in Gikuyu or he wrote it in English?
Let me touch on this. Ngugi has contributed to all genres of literature except one, poetry. I don't know, I haven't seen his collection of poems. And he has about 300 pieces. He's one of the most prolific writers in the African tradition. And in fact, if you look at the history of Europe, the only guy that might surpass him is Shakespeare himself.
Oh my God!
I have his CV. I have it on my WhatsApp. I can show you. Over 300 pieces. Plays like with Mithuru Mugo, What Do You Want, I Want,
yes.
And he has a lot of writings, memoir, autobiography. He's written prison notebooks, the prison diary, satire on Sesosoko, African leaders who sit tight, we call them now, like the president in Cameroon who have spent 30-40 years ruling. So he was also, if you like, a critic of neo-colonialism, or some people call it post-colonial culture, that many African countries found themselves in. So he was strong. He has actually 3 legs. One was as a critic of colonial culture, and then he became also a critic of the developments inside African countries themselves. What happened? People use the word neocolonialism.
Yes.
And then there's a third one. He's paying attention to how indeed the problems didn't just emerge from space, from just individual, but the institution.
The institution.
Democracy.
Yes.
Transplanted from the Western world to African countries, which was just implemented without any adjustment for African normativity, African culture, African traditions.
So can we consider this, Prof, as a theme of his novel, that is that book, Almighty One I Want, which resulted in his imprisonment?
Yeah, that's right. Because of that book, actually, he was imprisoned.
Yes.
There was an Arab Moy who was the president there, who I think, from what I've read from new accounts, I think he despised Ngugi.
Yes.
Because several times, in fact, he organized a public rally against Ngugi. His books were denounced and so on. In that, it's just that what choices should Africans now have? Because remember, Ngugi was also influenced by Marxism.
Yeah, Marxism.
He was a Marxist for a long time. He never left it, but it was diluted with some Pan-Africanist and nativist cultures. Understand, or consciousness, or philosophy, or whatever you want to call it. And so, in that book, I think it's like giving a lift to the Mau Mau.
Yes.
Now the Mau fought against colonial culture.
Yes.
Now they should fight against the indigenous. What he calls them in his own non-fiction writing, comprador bourgeoisie. The comprador bourgeoisie is a bourgeoisie that has no creativity. It doesn't have industry. It's only dealing in buying and selling and taking loans from Western countries, and then implementing policies that would also allow colonial culture to go on thriving, and also the local, a small class of people in the nativist community benefiting from the arrangement. And you know, if you look at Kenya, it's one of the most developed countries. I don't know where it's still the case, but the Europeans built up, if you look at the capital city, Nairobi, but it has the biggest ghetto in the world. I've been there. You see fantastic modern architecture with the Kibara. Kibara is the largest ghetto in the world, followed by the one in the Philippines. So there was huge disparities of wealth. Most Kenyans were deprived of because the intrusion of foreign capital, intrusion of foreign investors meant that you could see by the coastal areas, fantastic, super postmodern, if you like, buildings, while the ghettos. This is explored by another writer called Major Mwangi in Going Down River. And Ngugi was the first the first East Africa writer to write that with no child.
With no child.
He came to prominence, and then he went on, and then the Pan-Africanist streak began to manifest when he argued that we should stop writing in English language.
But before we come to that, I would like to ask this. There were so many Kenyan writers who also contributed to the development of Kenyan literature. Why the works of Ngugi Wa Thiang'o thrived more than the ones that...
Yeah, I think it's because he is the most gifted. No, we don't say better. I don't say he's the best. No, we don't use that term in literature. Gifted, the most gifted. I think he's the most... his corpus Latin for body of works or collection work, I think was the most outstanding, and he quickly got international recognition. And also, but this is what I have to say, if you read his works, you will not say that this is a guy who learned English. Yeah, that's right. He's a master of the language. In fact, he probably wrote better English than Conrad. Or even some of the people, even Dickens, because he learned remarkable. He learned English. His proficiency is so high that you cannot say this is a non-native speaker learning English and writing it, and so on. So, and all the other writers were all his grandchildren, if you like, in literary terms. In my opinion, the most outstanding one is Major Mwangi, who wrote Carcass for Hounds, Kill Me Quick, and Going Down River Road. Read the books; they are outstanding. They are, in fact, he's closely following Ngugi's. Although he innovated where Ngugi didn't. Ngugi wrote the realist novel.
Yes.
The realist novel was simply an attempt to imitate the camera, to offer an authentic, clear portraiture of things. But Moja Mwangi wrote a naturalistic novel, which is very close to realism. But it also has the some element that exceeds realism, in the sense that the characters themselves, no matter how good they are, no matter how great, eventually nature or some natural or some cultural flaw or a personal failing will do them in, and then they come to nothing. They never rise above their conditions, even when they have not died.
Yes. So Ngugi's work were, first of all written in English language, and later he changed his own mind by writing his own native language, that is Kikuyu.
Yes.
Do you see this as a radical movement towards African?
My view is that, in 1986 he wrote the decolonization of the mind.
Yes.
We teach it in the department.
Yes.
He, in fact, as early as 1966, there was a conference of Makerere. 96? Oh, no, 96. It was 94. I can't remember. But between 1961 and 1964 or 5, there was a Makerere conference. Achebe was there.
Yeah.
In which he argued that the best way to boost African languages, to help them rise to international stature or prestige, is for writers, gifted writers, write in the native languages. Well, Achebe opposed him at that conference. Achebe said that no, he has the heritage of the English language and he will use it, only that he will bend it to suit his Igbo. At that time, in my opinion, Achebe took a very reactionary position. But his argument didn't win out, because most African writers didn't get that, really, they were not persuaded by his arguments and so on. Yeah, but by 1984-85, if you look at his previous works in 1981, Writers in Politics, you can see there are many several editions of it. He began to argue that, why are we boosting a foreign language? Now, his argument, which you can see in the Declaration of the Mind, is that now this language heralded colonialism, our subjugation by colonial culture, and that we cannot free ourselves from colonial culture if we don't free ourselves from that language, and so develop indigenous languages. So he wrote that book, Declaration of the Mind. His argument is that, we should do, let's say, devote 80% to writing in our native languages. But there was a contradiction. He himself, he stopped writing English and began to write in Gikuyu. Sometimes it's written Kikuyu, the way you pronounce it.
Yes, it's like people take it like a Gikuyu, the language, and Kikuyu is their culture.
Yeah, that's right. So, but people said, well, how would your books get international audience, international audience? How would you expand your readership? So, paradoxically, he began to translate Petals of Blood into Gikuyu. But then what he wrote in, I can't pronounce, Gakaya, I don't pronounce the language, but it's very difficult. It's
Ingaika Indenda?
Not that one. There was another he wrote about street people in postmodern Nairobi.
Yes.
But he wrote it in his language.
Gikuyu, yes.
Kikuyu is the. But then he himself began to translate it back into English.
Wow. So why is that?
Yeah, because he realized that, let me just, I'm being judgmental here.
Yes.
I think he realized the limits of what I call his romanticism. Yeah, because he underestimated the extent to which the English language cultures had developed so much. They have dominated the world. Even some European languages like German, like French, were declining relative to English. And he realized that actually to reach people in Nigeria who don't speak Gikuyu, who don't speak Kikuyu, he would need to write in English. So, but toward the end of his life, he was writing a fiction. He did write something in Swahili. I don't know whether he finished it, but then he began to translate it back into English. So the argument for African writing in African languages, I think, didn't win out. It didn't win out. But toward the end of his life, I think about 5 years ago, he was in Nigeria, I think about 6-7 years ago, to attend a conference here in Abuja. An interview I read it because I didn't want to come here and be reading an interview. He was asked a question. He said he was now moving to creative non-fiction.
Creative non.
Yeah,
What is that?
See, I have some of the creative non-fiction is that now you write a fictional text, moving with realistic, factual portraiture or facts. You write fiction, but you interlace the fiction with real things, like, for example, Second World War or the Mau Mau, or things that really happened that historians agree that did happen. So he called it creative non-fiction.
Okay.
Yeah, but in the last 10 years, he wasn't very well. He had 2 bypass surgeries, which he was frail, and then he was overweight.
Yes.
He wasn't really in good health, and then he had having medical issues. Despite that, the guy wrote, I think if you count it from what I have, the records, I think he has over 300 pieces.
Wow.
He is the most prolific African writer, in my opinion. And the only guy that might rival him, not in terms of corpus, in terms of the power of the writing, is Ayukwe Ama.
The Ghanaian writer.
He now lives in Senegal. He now lives in Senegal.
In Senegal.
Yeah.
From Ghana to Senegal.
Yeah, his latest novel is something about empire, which I have in as I grow older, I forget titles. Something of the empire, I have read it.
All right. So Prof, do you think that Ngugi stands on equal literary footing with some African writers like Wole Soyinka or Chinua Achebe?
In my opinion,
Yes.
Ngugi is, in my opinion, Ngugi is far ahead of Soyinka and Achebe. Now let me tell you why I say this. In the case of Soyinka, has been bolstered by the Nobel Prize, and so that's a boost for around the world in Africa, in traditional literary foundations, and like the Nobel, like the Booker.
Yes.
But if any academic who knows, who is well versed in the writings of the three, I think Ngugi stands out. I think, in my opinion.
So Soyinka was boosted by.
Yeah, I think so. He received a great boost by that Nobel, but Ngugi wrote only. Achebe wrote only 6 novels. Ngugi had, no. In case of Soyinka, that prestige of the Nobel, and then he's, Ngugi was a much more ideologically sophisticated guy than both of them. Ngugi was a Marxist, also accepted some Africanist themes, and also his nativist, Africanistic authenticity. And he was a more passionate writer, more committed to his own politics and his own vision than Achebe and Soyinka.
So, sir, Prof, how did Ngugi's imprisonment and exile shaped his own later works?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I have a piece that I've just read. Is on my. I got it somewhere. That imprisonment, he was imprisoned several times, and he was molested in prison.
Oh my gosh.
Out of more, I think, hated or despised. So that humiliation, imprisonment. He wrote a prison diary on toilet paper.
Yes.
Yeah, he was lucky because the warden allowed it.
Yes.
Because Araboy left instruction that he didn't have access to TV or telephone or any writing. He couldn't read books or write anything. It was the toilet paper.
Yes.
And our warden, thanks to, we owe that warden appreciation now in literary history.
Yes.
I think many people have argued, psychologists have argued that it changed his mind. I'm not surprised because I had a fracture in 2005. I spent 3 months in hospital, nursing my leg. My psyche changed slightly. I saw the world differently, and I dropped some of my personal weaknesses. So long imprisonment, long isolation, and what do you call this in prison? When you're isolated alone, give me the term.
Solitary
confinement. If it happens anyway, it will change you. So now it pushed him to think about the depredations of post-independent politician, post-independent disillusionment. This idea that the local rulers have simply continued with the culture of colonialism.
Of course.
That they are even worse. In fact, he argued in one of his essays on this Matigari, that actually they are worse than the colonialists because the colonialist is clear. He is here to take your resources and is there to impose hegemony. But they are natives. They are nativist. They have a native presence in the culture, and they mobilize people for so-called development, which never took place. The corruption, the depredation, the inability to build an industry or to industrialize their country, or actually to mount a new innovative way of ruling countries post-colonialism. So that's what changed. I think you can see it in his prison diary, in his memoir and non-fictional prose.
But Prof, Ngugi, after all these happenings, exiled to first UK and later to the United States of America. And in fact, he was writing against colonialism, the system, and also the people themselves. And now, during his exile, he went to UK and later to the United States of America. Some people see this as a contradiction. Why can't he just live in an African country?
I think I was asked a question and I contributed to a debate on that. You see, one of the okay, let's call it performative contradiction.
Okay.
You perform A, but you do B. We call it performative contradiction in logic.
Yes.
That is, you say, for example, you are a vegetarian, but you buy meat, you eat, or even if you eat it, you give meat to your children and you promote meat culture. So at one time he had to leave Kenya, but he could have gone to, as I argue, he could have gone to a South African university or even Makerere or even university in Morocco or Ethiopia or many African universities. There then no repression. But it is a trend, I think, to be fair to Ngugi. You can see Gayatri Spivak, Homi Baba. For most emigre, we call them exiles or emigre. You know, in French you don't pronounce the last consonant. So let's say exile and emigres.
Yes.
So the emigre, many of people who are educated in the former colonies, eventually because of their education, all of them now are congregated in the West. From the, when we say West, America and Europe, and so on, and they are there in many African studies departments, many African centers. So that's one criticism. I wrote a piece about 2-3 years ago in a debate on TED Fund WhatsApp about why should that be so. Many of them, Ngugi chose to just live in the US. Achebe died in the US, remember?
Yes, sir.
Only Ayikwe Ama and Shoyinka. But Shoyinka too had a long stint in the West. But now he's living in Nigeria, but Ayikwe Ama is now living in Senegal. And the guy who wrote from Akurukeri, what's his name? This guy, his name keeps escaping, but I have his book on my desk.
Yes.
He's in Italy. Most of them migrated to the West. But they were academics. You see, the one thing interesting about all the African writers, early African writers, were also university lecturers.
Of course.
All of them. So now they were, or some of them are still teaching American students, not African students. So I call it a performative contradiction. I think it's unfortunate. So that's one part of them that I think that is not salutary. I think I'm critical of that aspect of their lives. Like Ngugi. He lived there. In fact, however, someone pointed out to me in a debate that had he not, or had Achebe not lived in the way, they would have died earlier. Because there's advanced advanced medical facilities. There's high pharmaceutical and medical institutions there that can take it. He also had two bypass surgeries. No, most bypass surgeries are done only once, and so on. And Achebe too. So that's why I said in one program that he should have died 10 years ago. Some people didn't get the figure of speech. Yeah, because perhaps if he had lived in, but people now, there are many people who now are in Egypt, are in Germany, in London, in India. Even though they live here, they go there now. There is medical tourism.
Viewers and listeners, don't forget you're listening to this interesting literary program, The Pen, from BUK FM and BUK TV. And we're hosting Professor Ibrahim Bello-Kano from the Department of English and Literary Studies, where we've been discussing the works and life of Ngugi Wa Thiang'o. Let's go for a short break, and when we come back, the program continues.
BUK TV. The station is presently located on NatchComSat, satellite parameter 42.5 east, channel 12725, symbol rate 1500, on vertical polarization and satellite border 7 angle, 26-degree E frequency, 11010 polarization, vertical symbol rate 27500. Join us on our social media platforms on Facebook, Instagram and X at BUK TV, and on YouTube, BUK TV Radio. BUK TV, broadcasting for knowledge and innovation.